Hello and welcome to the Department of Geography. I thought I should welcome you from the department library, which is my background. I'm afraid I'm not in the department library, but we're looking forward to reopening our buildings and going back in from the 1st of October as we look forward to what's going to be an unusual academic year, to say the least. It's wonderful to have such a large turnout from our alumni and colleagues at this alumni festival event. Those who are geography alumni, I know this is an event which is open to all Cambridge alumni, but those who are geography alumni, I hope you've received in the last few days a copy of our most recent alumni magazine, Landmark, which has a number of really interesting articles and brings you up to date with things that are happening in the department. We'll be sending more information in our next electronic newsletter. I'm hoping to send something out in early October. And of course, there's a lot of information online on our alumni web pages on the department, including that most recent copy of Landmark for anyone who doesn't get the physical copy. So you should be able to find that online. The alumni pages also have details of a number of other events and initiatives. In early July, we had a wonderful farewell event for our colleague, Professor Bill Adams, who's retiring at the end of this month in a few days' time. So if you weren't able to attend it in person, there's a video of that event online on our alumni pages, and please do log in and have a look. We've also got a number of other new plans and initiatives. We've just launched a new Student Opportunities Fund. So there's a lot of information on our alumni pages that people might be interested in following up. I'm really delighted to have a fantastic group of people to join us today on this panel, Living with Risk in the Anthropocene. And I will very briefly introduce all four panelists before inviting them to start. I don't want to take up too much of what is a very brief session of 1 hour. So I'll introduce the four panelists and then I'll invite them to speak briefly before opening this up for a discussion and conversation. Please use the question and answer box in order to ask questions for the panelists. And as I said, if you'd like to have conversations amongst yourselves as well, use the chat function to do that. So over to the panel. Clive Oppenheimer is Professor of Volcanology in the Department of Geography. He researches magmatic and volcanic processes, long-range climatic and societal impacts of eruptions, and obsidian provenancing. He enjoys collaborations at the nexus between the natural sciences, arts, and humanities, and has morphed into a filmmaker in recent years with Into the Inferno, which launched widely around the world in 2016, and the recently premiered Fireball, both produced with Werner Herzog as director. Fireball premiered, I think, last week at the Toronto International Film Festival. Our second panelist is Emma Maudsley. Emma Maudsley is reader in human geography in the department and is a fellow of Newnham College. She's a human geographer with a particular interest in the rising powers and the changing politics of development. She's done research on development politics, on India's growing middle classes and environmental change and environmental issues in India more broadly. Howard Nelson, our third panelist, is a lecturer in conservation leadership with a complex set of affiliations to the Department of Geography, to our master's program in conservation leadership, and to Fauna and Flora International as part of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative partnership. He is a fellow of Lucy Cavendish College with research which focuses around issues related to Caribbean island ecology and conservation, focusing on three broad themes: patterns of wildlife populations over time and space, socio-ecological dimensions of natural resource use, and the science policy interface of protected areas and wildlife management. Howard serves on DEFRA's Darwin Expert Committee, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, on the board of the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute and the Global Diversity Foundation. And finally, our fourth panelist is Fiona Reynolds. Dame Fiona Reynolds is Master of Emmanuel College. She came to Emmanuel in 2012 after a long career in the voluntary sector. most recently as Director General of the National Trust from 2001 to 2012. She had a transformative impact on the National Trust, bringing some of their houses to life, as well as raising the profile of the Trust's work in relation to nature, the countryside, and the environment. So I hope you'll agree that this is an amazing group of people to hear from, and you certainly don't want to hear from me. So I'm going to hand over to Clive and try and operate your slides at the same time. So over to you, Clive. And I think that might be your first image.
That's right. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Bhaskar, for the introduction. And greetings to everybody. I won't say good afternoon because I think you're tuning in from all kinds of time zones. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to aim to give just an overview of the challenges of protecting people at risk from volcanic activity. And although considerable progress has been made, many of the fundamental scientific questions remain open. And events continue to remind us that science alone hasn't got all the answers when it comes to safeguarding society. So the first slide here is a sad illustration of the problem. On the left is a figure taken from a paper published in 2012 that shows a simulation of tsunami at Krakatau volcano in Indonesia. And the paper is predicting, given a scenario, the wave heights around the shorelines there of Java and Sumatra. Krakatau, of course, is infamous as the site of the 1883 eruption that claimed 36,000 lives, mostly as a result of tsunami. The photograph in the middle is a picture of the devastation just before Christmas in 2018, when a relatively minor landslide on the volcano did generate tsunami, and over 400 people were killed. This is a very poignant reminder that science is not enough. I mean, if I try to imagine if I'd authored this paper, how would I feel? Would I think I didn't do enough beyond publishing the work to go and connect with society, connect with policy making to try and bring in some kind of an early warning system? If we could advance to the next slide, please, Bhaskar. What I'd like to do is next to pose a more general problem. And I'd like you to imagine that you're the head of a volcano observatory. Perhaps it's Vesuvius, and your monitoring equipment is picking up new signs of unrest. There are more earth tremors. There are some stronger gas emissions from the crater. Perhaps the land surface is inflating. All of these might be signs that magma is on the rise. What would you do? How would you advise on when the signals are threatening enough to recommend evacuating tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of people, which of course is going to be immensely disruptive to lives and livelihoods? Next slide, please, Bhaskar. Of course, this isn't an easy question at all, and there are immediately two sides to the problem. The first is the limits to our understanding of how volcanoes work. Magma is an extremely complex material. It consists of the three phases of matter. It's got solid crystals in it, it's got a molten silicate liquid, and it's got gas bubbles. And the behavior of this fluid, it transforms very radically as it rises towards the surface. So this is not an easy material to characterize in terms of its physics or to model it. Sorry, Bhaskar, just if we track back one. So there's only so far we can take this knowledge of, for example, what triggers volcanic eruptions to make accurate forecasts of volcanic activity. The illustration here is actually from 1825, from a seminal work by George Poulet-Scrope. And this was the early 19th century understanding of what it looks like underneath a volcano. And I have to say that image doesn't look very different from a figure in one of my somewhat more recent papers, a couple hundred years on. So, you know, if you saw the two, you would think that we hadn't made an enormous amount of progress. The other side of the problem is human society. And the best science in the world is of limited use if society is unprepared for it or even distrustful of it. Next slide now, please, Pascal. So what is the state of the art? As I've alluded, we have now sophisticated techniques for monitoring. This is the nerve center of the Chilean operation. Each of those panels up on the wall is a computer screen with a live feed out of seismic and geodetic and thermal and other data from volcanoes up and down the country. And the layout of the room here is also rather cunning. In the front row are the observers who immediately identify any anomalous behavior on one of the volcanoes, and they pass that information up to the next row, who will integrate that with other historical data and other information to contextualize the new anomalies. And the last slide, please. But in Chile, as in other places, they've well recognized that the science has to go in hand with community action to build knowledge of hazards and also of the responsibilities of citizens when alert levels are raised. And so they put a tremendous amount of effort into engaging with communities threatened by restless volcanoes. And this kind of work is going on in many countries around the world and is already paying off in terms of mitigating the impacts of eruptions. So, you know, that's the critical thing. We have the science, and that has to go hand in hand with society. And I'd like to conclude by paraphrasing Ulrich Beck, who I know will be beloved of many of our alumni, who said something along the lines of global risks can inspire terror, or they can create new room for action. I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. That's a wonderful start. I'm going to move without further ado straight on to Howard, who's next. Howard, would you like me to pull up your first slide?
Yep, I only have one slide, Bhaskar, and I just want to start off by saying thanks very much for the opportunity to be on the panel today. The year 2020 has been an eventful year, and certainly COVID-19 has forced us to reflect on how we interact with each other and with nature. It's forced us to look at our vulnerability to the complex interactions between biodiversity, climate, equity, and to the global economy. I know the metaphor of life on Earth, represented as a library, is an old one, but I want to use it here because it captures the irreversibility and the scale of the crisis facing biodiversity and life on Earth. For those of us in biology, there's a recognition of the great paradox of our generation, that just as our genetic tools are finally allowing us to read the library of life, that very library is being destroyed. Thus, as we're beginning to understand the words and underlying stories of life represented in each of these species and ecosystems, we're irretrievably erasing them. This year was to be a big milestone for conservation. It was the year of reckoning for a range of 20 global targets for the conservation of nature that were called the Aichi targets. These were established in 2010. In the build-up to this, we've had a series of global reports released. They all reiterate the value of nature to the human enterprise, and these include the UN's Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services 2019 Global Assessment Report. We've had the Convention on Biological Diversity's 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, and the latest Living Planet report put out by the Zoological Society of London and the WWF. And these last two have only come out this month. To save you reading all three, the bottom line is that after a decade of work, none of the global targets for nature have been met. The rate of loss of habitats and species is accelerating, and every time we look, more and more of these species and systems are starting to show signs that they're being irretrievably altered. This is important for so many reasons, because while much of our 21st century life gives the impression that we stand apart from nature, these reports say otherwise. So for instance, the IPBES Global Assessment reiterates that we continue to rely on nature for our basic needs. For instance, 75% of global food crops rely on animals to pollinate them. This erosion of nature's systems greatly increases the risk to us as a global family that relies heavily on nature for goods and services. For instance, we know that 4 billion people today rely on natural medicines for their healthcare, and 70% of the drugs that we're using for cancer treatment are derived from nature. Experts have been warning of a pandemic such as COVID for decades and predicted that as we lose biodiversity, our risk of global pandemics would increase. Thus, since 1940, there's been a consistent increase in the number of emerging infectious diseases from wildlife-related zoonoses, and these, of course, due to the loss of biological diversity. So, what do we do to reduce our exposure to these vulnerabilities? In the past, we've tried to appeal to the concern for our children, couching biodiversity in the language of intergenerational equity in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, which calls on us specifically to make a concerted effort to protect biological diversity. We've tried to appeal to the explicit link between goods and services for nature and linking these to monetary value. A good example of this is the UN Environment Programme's TEEB program, which stands for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. We've tried to exclude people from nature. We've created parks, and lately our targets have been to make these even bigger. But the bottom line is that we're still failing at a global level to stem this tidal wave of loss. Now, fundamentally, our investments to mitigate these risks to people and nature are just not of the scale that we're required to address the task. So for instance, there was a paper about 6 or so years ago that basically suggested that we need about $76 billion a year to try and mitigate some of this. But our best data suggests that we're only committing to about 12% of this. Now, for comparison, the UK's economy, for instance, is worth about 2.8 trillion a year. We definitely need a step change, and we need to demonstrate a true commitment if we want to save nature's stories. I want to end my introduction by returning to my library metaphor. We've known for a long time that we don't need to read every book to be able to save the library. We need to recognize that business as usual is not working at the scale that we need. COVID has demonstrated that when we are presented with a crisis, we can make a dramatic change to our way of life. The biodiversity crisis is calling for this kind of dramatic intervention to reduce the risk of the loss of biodiversity and the loss of life's library. Thanks.
Many thanks, Howard. And let's move on to Emma, who's going to follow next. Over to you.
Thanks, Bhaskar, and thanks, everyone. So Bhaskar asked if I would talk particularly around what we call, rightly or wrongly, the Global South. And I guess I would start by saying that geography really is an extraordinary discipline to think about and define and critique the Anthropocene. And Clive was mentioning science, and that social science isn't enough on its own. And neither is social science or arts and humanities enough on their own. And I'm really proud to be part of a discipline that does its best to produce radical, critical, rigorous science and social science and arts and humanities. And I think this, this is extraordinary in the sense that the Anthropocene is this multifactorial, enormous challenge for society. But one of the things that geography, I'd like to think in its more recent iterations, is also sensitive to is global diversity and difference. We've got a long way to go, of course, but we have always been a discipline that has, well, we've reformed ourselves over the years, and our engagement through close relationships and partnerships in the Global South has been critical. So one of the obvious things to say about the Anthropocene and the Global South is that the Global South remains neglected. Southern voices in, for example, defining and dating the Anthropocene remain neglected. If we think about the Anthropocene Working Group on the International Commission of Stratigraphy, it is diverse in lots of ways, but the story is still a very Eurocentric one. So Richard Grove, who some of you will know, the sadly just past wonderful historian of environmentalism and environment and imperialism, he talked about colonial, the European ships arriving in places like Australia and discharging like viruses, this DNA into the Australian environment that of course was so disruptive. And for many parts of the global south, the sort of a seismic shift came about in human nature relations with the arrival of explorers, travelers, settlers, and of course colonialism. And this slide here shows the fact that, of course, the global south has its own histories in relation to the human nature interactions, and often very profound as well. Of course, there's long histories of extinctions caused. The Maori had wiped out all species of moa before the arrival of the Europeans. So these different histories of congruence, of stewardship, of destruction, of extraction are diverse and different between and across the north and the south. And it's very important that geography pays attention to that. So we can find any number of examples today, whether it's who's going to be the powerful voices in the COP meetings coming up. The oil lobbyists and the big powerful OECD countries will have a far, far bigger voice than the smallholders and the smaller countries, the poorer countries, the formerly colonized countries. So we need to ensure that our politics of the Anthropocene pays attention to the relationship between power and knowledge, who gets to define, prioritize, date, and so on. So I want to just finish with a few thoughts about then teaching on this. And I was reminded of a trip I was on last year, the Morocco field trip, which Bhaskar has undertaken many times. Bhaskar is, everyone mistakes him for a fantastically famous Indian film star. So whenever you're walking around somewhere in Morocco with Bhaskar, he gets lots of, warm appreciation and glances, and it's like being as part of Bhaskar's fame posse. But we go to Morocco most years, or we have done, and we do, many of you, perhaps some of you here will have been on that trip. And we go up to the Atlas Mountains and we work in a valley which, as Tim Bayliss-Smith and Liz Watson and others have talked about, that amazing sort of local sort of basket of activities. People rely on remittances from Marrakesh and much further afield. They are engaged in rain-fed and irrigated agriculture. They rely on tourism and so on. So this is a classic sort of, what you could say, what once would have been a peasant, but always a globally integrated and mobile culture, which has lots of different activities that help create a basket of and bundle that makes up a livelihood. And they have differential vulnerabilities. In some ways, they are intensely vulnerable to the changes of the Anthropocene, whether it's a global pandemic. The tourism industry is now closed down in that valley, and that's disastrous for them. But on the other hand, we always get our students to do a small project, and they are amazing. I'm not just saying this. The students come up over basically 3 days with a remarkable project, and it's just a little toe in the water, but they do great stuff. And one of them, one group last year, looked at the impact of less snow, less precipitation, freezing and falling in the Atlas Mountains, due almost certainly, as we know, to climate change. And what they found was that while when people as farmers were very worried about this, they could see the irrigation was going to start drying up. Where they were in a tourist-facing role, the earlier sort of cessation of snow and the extension of the season meant that more tourists could come up. And of course, very often the farmers also had a little shop facing the tourists. So we saw these differential relationships, and this was a student-led project. They came up with it themselves. And in a sense, what they were doing was engaging with the complexities of the Anthropocene for the everyday and longer-term existence. And they also talked to people about what they thought their belief, about the science, and indeed what people started to talk to them about what they thought God intended through these changes. So we in the department, I think we are really engaging in directly or indirectly with the Anthropocene in every way. And my very last comment, if I've got a moment, Bhaskar, is to talk about the importance of the politics of hope and of imagining both desirable and plausible futures. And I think, as for all of us this is true, but particularly as educators, we are really good at finding problems, and there's an awful lot of problems to find. You don't have to open your door and step out very far before it's dark times that we live in. So it's become more and more important to me to think about how do we give our students plausible and imagined desirable futures to think about, to achieve, to fight for. And I've worked with wonderful students like Sophie Thorpe and Francesca Rigg, who we put on a day of the geographies of hope. That was a wonderful engagement with the real practical ideas about how we make positive change. So I think the Anthropocene demands the recognition of diversity and difference around the world, of inequalities of power, recognizing resilience in many global South communities without romanticizing it, and also it puts upon us the importance of teaching and thinking about positive change and how we might possibly get there. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Emma. Finally, Fiona, can we turn to you for your brief opening remarks? And there's already lots of really interesting conversations happening in the question and answers and chat, so please do keep those coming.
Well, thank you, Bhaskar. I'm a geographer too, as some of you know. Spent most of my life in the voluntary conservation movement, but a little bit of government and a little bit of business thrown in there. So I'm going to talk about responses to some of these global crises. I'm going to cover two issues. There are many more, but these are the two that I feel are really crucial. One is how and when we respond to crises, and the second is who responds. I'm going to focus on climate and nature, which I think are the two sort of existential crises we now face. And I think the shocking reality is that it's taken us over 30 years to respond to the climate change crisis. Now, IPCC was set up in 1988. The Earth Summit, which I was very actively involved with, was in 1992. And we talked then of the need for a global response to these issues. And yet, the net zero target, which was introduced in 2019 by our government to get to net zero by 2050, took, as I say, 30 years to get there. We've been conscious of our role in extinctions and in the degradation of nature for much, much longer. Although I think it has to be said that we've only realized that it's reached critical levels in the last period. But I think analysis, and Howard touched on this, is clear that in about 1950s, we reached that tipping point where globally, and of course, as Emma said, the activity is much more weighted to the north rather than the south. But globally, we reached a point where we were outstripping nature's capacity to regenerate through the exploitation of resources and the way we've managed the world. And so, yet in this country, we only now have a policy to reverse the decline of nature. We haven't even got a real policy to restore it to anything like a balance. So, yeah, the COVID crisis, as we all know, has caused an instantaneous, radical, immediate response. Now, whether it's the right response, we still don't know, but government that was apparently ideologically opposed to massive state intervention and spending lots of money has done exactly those two things without a moment's hesitation for obvious and important reasons. And yet, as Howard explained, COVID itself is caused by our degradation of nature and by the disruption to the climate that we as humans have made happen. So there's a kind of sense of why have we responded so immediately to that and yet so slowly to the climate and nature crises. Why are they so different? I mean, three brief thoughts. One is the immediacy of the impact on COVID, the death of people, yet climate is causing death throughout the world, nature loss is causing death throughout the world, but it's the immediacy of those issues. The visibility of those impacts, and yet, you know, outside I can hear the wind roaring, we're getting much more extreme climate events, and yet we still don't seem to feel the pressure. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, the time frame of those impacts. These longer term declines we find very much harder as a society to respond to. So second, who responds? Ultimately, of course, it must be governments, but governments are shaped both by, ultimately by the voters, by the people, and by who lobbies them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the NGOs and business. They are the crucial actors in the role. And, you know, as someone who's personally been lobbying on climate and nature for the last 30 years, I have to confess that clearly I haven't done a great job. You know, it's not been for the want of trying, but these issues take a long time. The classic scenario is that the NGOs are first on the case with very radical calls for change. Government finds that difficult. It's often not until business gets it and starts to engage that government starts to listen. And eventually government is the last to act. And they act when they feel the population is ready. And so that loops back to the voters. It loops back to who they're listening to, how strongly people feel and engage in these issues, and whether the government feels it's ready. And clearly on COVID, the government felt that the country was ready for very radical intervention, but it's still treading very softly on these other existential crises that may end the planet's viability. So these are the contradictions that we're dealing with. So what can we do to change this dynamic? Well, that's really over to you in the questions, I think. You know, what can we do as a society to make long-term issues bite in the short term? You know, what is the role of us as a society? And perhaps just a little note of optimism, perhaps COVID, which has helped us to think about our relationship with nature. It's forced us to recalibrate our priorities. Perhaps there is a chance to use COVID as a way of seeking a more sustainable, greener future. Now, that was being talked about a lot 3 months ago. It's been talked about much, much less. But given that we're likely to face a series of pandemics, this is likely to be business as usual for us. Can we use that crisis to help us deal with the fundamental ones? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Emma, there's a set of questions around the politics of hope that I hope we might pick up on in relation to teaching, but I'm just going to look briefly down the question and answers. I think, Fiona, the point that you just made about timescales is a really important one, and I can see that there's somebody who's asking specifically about that, and in a way it kind of brings us full circle from the geological timescales that Clive was talking about at the beginning to the sort of immediacy of the pandemic and how society and governments and the civil society and NGO sectors are seeking to address some of those challenges, as well as who the different actors might be. I think there's also a question of how we act, and I think that pulls in, Howard, some of the questions around, you know, how do we make visible some of the kind of scales at which impacts are being felt and put them in conversation with the other scales at which interventions are happening, the billions that are being spent on in response to other types of challenges. And I think then also trying to think about this in terms of the living and non-living aspects of the planet that we all inhabit. You know, so the sort of the continuity between life forms as well as the sort of the earth systems that we are integrally part of. So I think there's a sort of question around what does living in the Anthropocene actually mean? What does living mean in the context of an earth system that we are absolutely centrally part of? I'm going to maybe start with the question around timescales and ask if Clive would like to comment. I know his most recent film is also looking at sort of all kinds of collapsed timescales. So Clive, do you want to come in on the sort of question around these different timescales and how we engage with them cognitively as a human species?
Yeah, I think, you know, on one hand, everything we see now is written in history, and it's as if we like to think that we're so modern that things like famine in Europe and plague and all this kind of thing can't happen, conflict, but it's all there in our recent history, and it will clearly play out again. I think, you know, another aspect of the timescale is very much connected with the other big player in all of this, which is media. You know, how government structures interact with media and put out press releases that are then news. Things like, you know, I mean, other examples of things like the heat wave in Europe. Which you know had a very high mortality, But this is something that is it's in the background, and somehow this isn't a problem. Air quality, whereas of course, you know, with a terrorist event, this is suddenly a very, very dramatic and big thing in the news. So I don't know. I don't really have an answer what it takes to give some kind of equivalence to these different kinds of threats in terms of how that will elicit some appropriate action. But of course, there are some very, you know, powerful lobbies and influences that dictate our news diet.
Emma, thinking about concepts of time, I mean, the Morocco field trip that you spoke of, we normally go at the end of a very hectic 2 terms of teaching at the end of Lent term. And as you progress up the Imlil Valley, time seems to slow down in a lovely way. So I think in a way, concepts of time are also, you know, culturally determined, aren't they? And, you know, the urgency that people feel in relation to certain types of challenges is, when we think about the sort of diversity of human responses, it's very different in different places. So, you know, if we were to try and think about some of these sort of issues around human response and timescales of response and timescales of environmental and global change in a context of this culturally diverse understanding of time, I think it's really important to see that people live with types of risk and types of change all the time, while also somehow being exposed to these new forms of risk and danger because of the acute nature of some of these challenges. So I just wondered whether sort of and you've worked in multiple parts of the world. So I think, you know, that kind of understanding of time, I think, is really an interesting one to draw you in on. And I'll ask Howard to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that in many parts of the world, people live with they're much closer to many forms of risk and have, as a result, a sort of a different mentality, but also different systems to cope with the risk. So, like I say, I mean, I think it's very important not to romanticize this in any way. But the truth is, and this is, as Fiona was saying, for people who live with a sort of proximity of, you know, the harvest failing. I mean, you know, the vast majority of us in the UK don't particularly worry about the harvest failing. We don't really feel it. We don't know it's happened. But if you're a smallholder in Malawi, you certainly do know that. And we, you know, so that there is a different relationship with risk, and certainly in looking at, you know, there's been a lot of work working with Indigenous people and smallholders and thinking about this time point. For many people that our students spoke to in Morocco, they could remember things that happened, like a very bad season one time, you know, back in 1950, an elderly Moroccan woman might have talked about, oh, well, we had that. So people have their own sense of time as well, you know, and their own histories of particular places. I think it is fair to say that these are accelerating, and there's an awareness that, you know, it's year after year and what's going on. So yeah, so people's kind of understanding of the circularity of time, or of the relationship between spirits and gods and social change and what might be happening in the environment. You have this kind of different temporalities and also different sorts of, oh my God, geographers, you'll remember this, ontologies of what shapes that risk in their lives. And the challenges, I suppose, to you know, to recognise the incredible vulnerability of not just those communities but ourselves in ways that is coming down the line very, very fast. That we're experiencing, you know, the Californian wildfires, you know, show just how quickly this is coming our way for those of us in more sort of slightly privileged and buffered parts of the world.
Howard, bringing you in, I think partly picking up on that, the sort of some of the frameworks that you talked about are very much driven by this approach of global science and global assessments, trying to shed light on some of the scale of impact, but also trying to put some monetary numbers on it to try and put it in context of how much is needed to change and how valuable what we're losing be.
It's really complicated, isn't it, Bhaskar? Because, you know, once you get to really large numbers, it's hard for the human mind to kind of comprehend some of these things. When we talk about billions or trillions of dollars or pounds being spent, you know, how do we bring that down to a number that's relatable to the average person? And, you know, picking up on what Emma was saying before about these issues of time and how time means different things to different people, whether is it circular, is it a one-way flow, and how different societies perceive that then affects the way we approach management of these natural resources, how we approach changes that are taking place in these ecosystems, and how we communicate those things. One of the big challenges that we have, you know, if we look at our responses to the climate emergency, is that it seems that a lot of times the countries are acting independently in their responses, not as a group. And unfortunately, we're seeing the same kinds of things almost play out in terms of biodiversity. The good thing with the international process is, I have to say, for instance, the ones I've been involved in most recently, like IPBES, there is, you know, that global discourse. There is that sense of urgency. There is that sense of needing to work together. The trouble is that there's often a disconnect between the folks that go to these meetings and then the actual decision makers that make the decision about how much money gets spent, how we actually engage people on the ground. So a local community at a particular site next to a protected area, how are they connected to that decision-making process at the global level? And so it's that disconnect in terms of governance and accountability and transparency. It's those things that really are affecting or helping accelerate the rate at which we're losing some of these resources. At least it's some of the explanation, I think.
Thanks, Howard. I'm going to try and pick up on a huge number of really fascinating questions in the Q&A, but there's a thread coming through here around, so what do we do? And there's a question around the politics of hope versus the politics of despair. And is it fair to characterize things like Extinction Rebellion as the politics of despair? Or, you know, what is the politics that we are seeing coming through from mobilization that is taking place? What is the role of NGOs? What is the role of the kinds of community pressures that are coming through? How can governments be persuaded to act? And there's a question, should the vested interests that are getting in the way? I mean, the logic seems incontrovertible. You know, what we're losing is so valuable, and there seem to be a small number of people standing in the way. Should we actually buy them out is an explicit question. So Fiona, I'm going to turn to you for some of those, at least kick us off on.
There's an awful lot in there. I mean, I think one of the things coming through the chat is, you know, how do we inspire people to ensure that the government does prioritise this more than it has done? And, you know, there's a whole spectrum of ways in which that happens, and XR has certainly been one of those. It's really lifted the agenda. I mean, it'll be interesting to see, you know, whether actually we need another XR in a couple of years' time. It's like Greenpeace was XR, you know, 30 years ago, and there's always needs to be somebody more radical than the next. But actually, and just thinking about the harvest point, we've had a failed harvest this year. I mean, if this was medieval times, we would have had not enough food for the country. And it's only because we're so separated from the land and separated from nature that for most people, they have no idea that there's actually a real problem in this year's harvest. All we'll do is we'll import more, and we'll, you know, the carbon footprint of our food will grow, and yet we don't seem to factor that in. So what is the sort of golden thread that will get government to move? And the golden thread seems to me to be very much about, you know, getting a shift into the long term. Frankly, you know, investing in fossil fuels is, nobody would do that now, because actually the long-term business case has shattered. That wasn't the case 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but it is now. So actually getting to see the long-term implications have begun to start to impact on shorter term decisions. And people do have a role to play in that, both as consumers, in what we buy and how we shape our lives, but actually also in the things that we demonstrate we care about. And I always quote David Attenborough, who says, you know, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they haven't experienced. And so to me, getting children close to nature, getting that back to Emma's point about the politics of hope and about getting young people to experience the joy of nature and to know about food and where it comes from and to understand more about the dynamics of the earth that we live in is absolutely crucial. So there's a long slow burn there. And then there's getting the government to reframe some of these things which they think are too far away, but actually when you look at them, like the fossil fuel examples, are really here and now. So it's kind of a mixture of long-term and short-term and engaging people in these issues more specifically. And as for the vested interests, well, you know, the government doesn't have a problem with getting rid of vested interests when it gets to the point, actually. It just hasn't had the point on so much of this yet. But I have to be an optimist. I fundamentally believe that the moment is coming now.
Clive, there's a sort of thread as well about communication and how to, one part of it is, can we have simple messages? Can we have the kinds of messages that have clearly resonated at the moment in relation to the urgency of response to the pandemic, but also a sort of broader question around our role as educators, as people who should be reaching out more with accessible and simple but not simplistic narratives that actually communicate the power of these issues and mobilize. And of course, you know, you've mentioned David Attenborough, the supreme communicator, but what is our role, you know, and maybe trying to draw that as our final set of comments around our role as geographers, our role as academic geographers, to try and be visibly out there communicating, either by agitating on the streets or by making the types of films that you've been making. What is our role in trying to get these narratives outside of the ivory tower into the mainstream discourse? So Clive, maybe you kick off, and then I'll just invite everyone to use that as their last couple of minutes to reflect on.
I just share one anecdote with you that I came across while making the new film. In 1994, there was a big earthquake in LA, the Northridge earthquake, middle of winter, and in the middle of the night, and people ran outside their homes. And pretty soon, a lot were calling the emergency services because there was a strange cloud in the sky, and people thought this was some noxious gas given out from the San Andreas fault or something. Of course, what had happened, the earthquake had knocked out the power grid. No one had ever seen the Milky Way before. You know, this is the most wonderful example of the disconnection from nature. And of course, you know, think how many of us live in urban environments now. We don't see the night sky. I mean, even living outside Cambridge in a village, you know, maybe see a dozen stars at night. We have become disconnected from our place in the cosmos. And I think we have many roles, and I think, you know, people, everyone is contributing in different ways. You know, some of us plug away in the very narrow, but really push far in a given direction. Some of us try and widen out, and I think, you know, all of this is important, and I think all of it is contributing to reminding us that we do need to hold nature and the cosmos in awe and recognize our place in it. And I think that's part of our role.
Great, thank you. Emma, do you want to come in on this and also maybe pick up on the questions around your politics of hope idea?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a question from Deborah Enzenbacher. Do we need to rethink geography in higher education? I think we do. I think that, you know, we have always been a practical and engaged subject. We've always done many different things in geography, from very abstract theorizing to geography that's highly applicable to the real world, as it were. But now I think we really also need to step up a little bit. But I would say that we're a university, and I feel that my job as an educator is also to promote rigor. So there's a lot of shouting out there. There's a lot of going to tweet. There's a lot of fake news. And one of the things that we can do is encourage our students to think critically and self-reflectively, but also to use data, to use real strong research to inform their opinions. The second thing I think is that we need to recognize diversity. There isn't a right route, and it's not my job to say, you should do this, X, Y, or Z. Join Extinction Rebellion or go and be a goodie in the World Bank. You know, I think that teaching people the range of ways in which they may choose to try to make a positive difference And then the third thing I think is providing examples, showing what people have done, how change has happened. And I think, you know, again, a lot of perhaps our younger students inevitably, just as I was, I had no idea about the feminist movement really when I was growing up. I didn't realize all these wonderful women had changed the world for me. And I think that we need as educators to provide that inspiration, to show the complexities as well. It's not just a case of Twitter, you know, tweeting. We need to show how movements amalgamated, went down wrong paths, did things then that wouldn't be appropriate now, but which help create paths for future positive change. So I think all of those things, I just a paper called The Geographies of Hope and Change, which critically engages, doesn't propagandize it. It gives people their own tools to think about how they can best change the world. I just got one quote from Victoria Ayodeji, who wrote in the Landmark issue this time. She said about being a black student in Cambridge, you can't be what you can't see. And I think, you know, that's a great phrase for thinking through this imaginative politics of what can change and then providing the tools to help change.
Thanks, Emma. Howard, let me draw you in. There's a question about, do we have degree tracks for people who can be trained to think critically about this? And of course, the Conservation Leadership Program is one example.
Absolutely.
But also the two new MPhils that we've launched this year, and we're expecting our first students to arrive on the Anthropocene, as well as on Holocene climates. And I guess in a sense, the direction of change within the Tripos itself, which has evolved greatly over the many years that it's been running, continues to get us to engage with these questions. I mean, much of what this panel has spoken of would be the standard fare for a 3-year undergraduate degree at Cambridge, because you'd be exposed to these debates and questions all the time. But how, very specifically turning to you before I come back to Fiona to round us up.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Bhaskar. I would just agree with everything that was said before. And, you know, coming after Emma and Clive, it's almost like there's almost nothing left to say about being an educator in Cambridge. Because the truth is that if the students come to us, they bring their awe from high school. And if we can nurture that and kind of, you know, teach them to be rigorous, but at the same time encourage their innovation, then it's through them that we're going to solve these complex issues. And part of the, for me, when we talk to the leadership students, for instance, we encourage them to embrace that complexity and to get used to speaking the language of multiple different disciplines and getting to know multiple different disciplines. And these things, I think, are the pathway to us trying to solve some of these issues. Because in truth, the issues of climate, issues of biodiversity, issues of equity, these things are really complex issues, and they're going to require thinking across many different disciplines. And so for me as an educator, the thing I think about is, how do I cultivate that awe? You know, how do I make sure that the students recognize that these are big problems, they're going to be complicated, and there are multiple dimensions, and we need to give them the tools to be critical, but at the same time, not to crush their awe. So I think I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. And Fiona, final words over to you.
Well, very briefly, I just want to say one thing about the long term, one thing about the short term. Long term, we need everyone to be an environmentalist. And actually one route for that is for everyone to be a geographer, because you can't be a geographer without realizing. But I can't think everyone be a geographer. Everyone an environmentalist, and I can't put it better than Clive. You know, we need awe, we need connection with nature, we need to value the things that money can't buy, but which are fundamental to our soul and our spirit and the kind of beauty of the world around us. So that's the long-term aim. We need to think about that from our education system all the way through. My short-term thing is junk GDP, because that's because it doesn't have a balance sheet. It's just about income and expenditure. And if we did one thing tomorrow to put a balance sheet back into our national way of thinking, that would do more than anything else to get these issues brought forward and more relevant and engaging. So that's my manifesto.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I think there's great agreement with that final comment of yours on GDP already popping through in the chat. So much appreciation. And from me to all four of you for being such a wonderful panel, for being so stimulating. I'm very apologetic to those who've asked questions for not having been able to address each one of them, but I have copied them. And my plan is to paste them into a chat so that this conversation can continue beyond the panel. So I'm hoping that we'd be able to address some of the more specific questions offline, but I'm also conscious that we've reached the end of our hour. Time goes very quickly when you're having fun. So thank you, Clive, Howard, Emma, Fiona. Thank you to the wonderful audience that's joined us from all over the world. I hope you've enjoyed it. Do tell colleagues who weren't able to join us that this will shortly go up on the internet on our website for anyone who'd like to watch it. And have a very good rest of the day and weekend as we look forward to the weekend wherever you are in the world. Thank you, everyone, and bye for now.
Bye, everybody.